Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. Today I am discussing the 17th song in Die Schöne Müllerin, Die Böse Farbe, or The Evil Color. And I'd like to let you know, in this video and every song in the remainder of this cycle, I will be discussing topics like self-harm and suicide. Nothing as graphic as depictions, but if you aren't into that, you may want to skip the remainder of this series. Linked to the previous song, Die Liebe Farbe, by way of extreme contrast, in that song, the Miller had lost all hope, singing of his failure and chasing death. In Die Böse Farbe, the Miller experiences a final surge of energy before the end. He longs for an escape from his situation, his own inner turmoil, of which he himself is the cause. But unfortunately, something stops him from escaping.
So grün nicht wär's, da draußen im Wald und Feld. Ich möchte die grünen Blätter all pflücken von jedem Feind. Ich möchte die grünen Gräser all weinen ganz totenbleich, weinen ganz totenbleich.
So far, each stanza has been divided into two sections. The brighter initial couplet and the reality of the second couplet, a darker minor. Ich möchte ziehen in die Welt hinaus. I'd like to go out into the wide world. A desire to restart this ordeal from the initial stage of wandering is followed by a realization that he cannot go out. Everywhere he looks, he sees the green, which reminds him of the hunter and the Müllerin. The Miller then fantasizes of destroying the green in the world, and on this expressive Neapolitan chord, daydreams of turning the grass deathly pale by his own weeping. Why, in Schubert's telling, does the Miller pause here on Totenbleich, interrupting the metric symmetry of the first two phrases? In Susan Youens' interpretation, the Miller realizes a split second after he sings Toten, deathly, that he is actually contemplating his own death. The shock sends him reeling, and the music jolts upwards in a massive deceptive motion, all the more so for the offbeat arrival on the Neapolitan sixth and high G in the vocal part. When speaking to himself in the first section, the Miller sings, leaping all over his vocal register, over an interval of an 11th. In the following stanza, the Miller speaks to someone else, the color green, and the interval range drops to essentially half, a mere sixth, before resuming the wider interval where he again sings to himself.
Weinen ganz totenbleich, weinen ganz totenbleich. Ach grün, du böse Farbe, du, was siehst mich immer an, so stolz, so keck, so schadenfroh, mich armen, armen, weißen Mann. Ich möchte liegen vor ihrer Tür in Sturm und Regen und Schnee und singe ganz leise bei Tag und Nacht das eine Wörtchen Ade. Das eine Wörtchen Ade.
You can see, in my translation, when the Miller is admonishing the grass for looking at him boastfully, I've translated the text Weißen Mann to simply white guy. Now, obviously neither Schubert or Wilhelm Müller would have been familiar with the modern concept of whiteness. The Miller as Weißen Mann is more a representation of how deathly pale he is, while probably also hearkening to the white flower of the mill. However, I do think there is something of the modern concept of whiteness in this text, especially when related to the Miller's fragility. It is imperative that we remember the Miller has created this scenario entirely on his own, distinct from any reasonable person's interpretation of reality. The Miller has simply found employment at a mill, experienced an awkward crush on the boss's daughter, blown this crush entirely out of proportion, and, without any indication from the maiden that his feelings were reciprocated, spirals into madness when she quote-unquote rejects him by falling for the handsome hunter. The Miller does not see the maiden as a person, She is a Frauenbild, a woman picture, an object, and as such, he is entitled to her love. It's this sense of entitlement that has driven him off the deep end and, I believe, relates to the modern concept of whiteness. Something interesting that I also found in Youens' book, related to gender, is a reference to the following stanza, where the miller describes himself as forlornly laying in front of her door, softly singing "Ade, Ade." Youens writes that this is a fantasy of utter abnegation, a fantasy 19th century readers would have construed as feminine in nature. Youens doesn't explain what she means by feminine in this situation, so I think it calls for some unpacking. I can imagine a certain type of person viewing the miller's actions as feminine, likely the in-group of that society, whatever the early 19th century analog to boomers was at the time. The miller is displaying weakness by pining after this woman. Men are not weak, women are weak, therefore the miller is effeminate. However, to me, the miller's actions are representative of exactly what masculinity has become, and in many ways, I think it is representative of how some people viewed masculinity in the time of Die Schöne Müllerin. As proof, I offer up a reference to the late 18th century book, The Sorrows of Young Werther, by Johann Goethe. This book was completed a generation earlier in the 1770s, but it caused quite a stir. The plot is focused around Werther's unrequited and hopeless love, and his eventual realization that death is the only escape from his situation. You know, if one doesn't consider just moving on with one's life as a possible escape. The novel caused quite a stir at the time, and even inspired some of the first, as far as we know, copycat suicides. Young men dressed as Werther killed themselves in the same fashion as the character in the books. In a way that I can't quite articulate, these copycat suicides, as with many today, seem to me to be part of a search for meaning in one's life. A search that has gone so far that a romanticized last-ditch effort supersedes one's own preservation instinct. If you are experiencing thoughts of self-harm or suicide, check the description of this video for a number to call. There is help available. In a way, creating a situation out of thin air with no real solution or actionable way out, as young Werther did, or our young Miller is currently doing, is not feminine. It is masculine, just as more men are likely to die by suicide than women. It is utterly masculine to cling to the androcentric hegemony so fiercely and desperately that we will die before letting it go. That as a man, we will forego love and happiness in order to fiercely cling to our own sense of entitlement and cultural power. Expectations are premeditated resentments. Let that sink in. It will change your life.
Das eine Wörtchen Ade. Und wenn im Schad ein Waldmann so fliegt ihr Fensterlein und schaut sie auch nach mir nicht aus, darf ich doch schauen hinein. Und in der Funde stehen hat das grüne, grüne Band, das grüne, grüne Band. Ade, Ade, und reiche mir zum Abschied eine Hand. Ade, Ade, und reiche mir zum Abschied eine Hand. Zum Abschied eine Hand.
In a final blow to the miller's desire, the Müllerin, hearing a hunting horn, opens her window to look out, but she doesn't look for the miller. She looks, of course, for the hunter. In a rush of dotted rhythms and a hemiola against the triplets of the piano, he orders her to untie the lute's green ribbon from her hair before saying farewell to her. Likely in his mind, not reality. Although, as I warned you, Die Schöne Müllerin is getting darker and darker all the time, and my own politics and interpretations of gender and race are sneaking into it more and more. I hope you enjoyed this journey through Die Böse Farbe with me. Up next is Trockene Blumen, or Withered Flowers.